Buonasera. Non so se devo parlare italiano o inglese, non so se qualcuno può darmi un riscontro. Comunque per me è la stessa cosa. Sentiamo un attimo la regia che ci dice. Shall we speak English or Italian? Ok. Preferisco in italiano, va bene, perfetto. Allora, buonasera a tutti di nuovo, grazie per essere venuti a questo dibattito su globalizzazione, nazionalismo e così via. L'ospite di questa serata è il professor Rafael di TELLA, che è professore ad Harvard ed ha una lunga esperienza in materia appunto di globalizzazione, come, questa è l'unica frase che dico in inglese, globalization and its discontent, cioè la globalizzazione ha lasciato molta gente indietro, i famosi ceti medi e anche altre grosse categorie di personaggi, specialmente nei paesi industrializzati, mentre ha favorito l'uscita dalla povertà di milioni di persone nei paesi in via di sviluppo, diciamo. E quindi questo è un problema, e quindi tanta gente è scontenta, e poi per gradini successivi da questo scontento si arriva anche al populismo, insomma il discorso è abbastanza noto. E un altro punto debole della globalizzazione sono le disuguaglianze che anch'esse sono aumentate nel mondo, anche per, come il professor Di Tella ci spiegherà, dei trattamenti fiscali che sono palesemente non progressivi, non adeguatamente, diciamo, come dire, pesanti, o comunque insomma rimarchevoli sui ceti più alti, che a volte sono favoriti, mentre invece potrebbero senza troppi problemi per loro stessi favorire di più le finanze pubbliche del paese di appartenenza. Ecco, questi sono i problemi che la globalizzazione lascia dietro di sé, che sono appunto molto complessi nella loro soluzione, e man mano che si procede nel tempo diventa più complicato risolverli, perché nel frattempo forze populiste, demagogiche o anche che semplicemente strumentalizzano questi problemi vengono al potere e creano difficoltà ulteriori anziché risolvere le questioni lasciate aperte. Ecco, di questo parleremo col professor Di Tella, appunto ripeto, lui è un professore è argentino di nascita, parla l'italiano meglio di noi tutti noi messi insieme, e ha studiato a Buenos Aires, dove si è laureato in economia all'Università di Buenos Aires, è olimpionico di scherma, questa è una cosa che va detta, magari non in tempi recentissimi, ha fatto 2 Olimpiadi, quindi lo dico io che per me è un segno di grande merito, e poi ha studiato economia, ha preso il suo PhD ad Oxford e adesso insegna ad Harvard da diversi anni, si è specializzato in queste tematiche. Professor Di Tella.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for the invitation. So the strategy for the talk is the conference is organized around this very ambitious topic, but what I'm going to try to do is to give you an example of how we approach studying these problems by focusing very narrowly on one specific set of issues. Okay, so that's more or less what I will try to do. I will try to present this project, which is a very specific project, and then I will open up, hopefully soon, for other questions, more broader questions about the issues at stake. Okay, so the project, the general title is we're studying together with Danny Roderick, also from Harvard, from the Kennedy School, this demand for protectionism, which is one of the features of this populist backlash that we're getting. There are many aspects, and I think in political economy we are interested in many of these aspects. One of them, of course, is the rejection of expertise, which I think is quite interesting. And another one, of course, is this idea of rejecting globalization and trade and movements of capital and of labor. Okay, so the specific paper I'm going to try to present today is called "Labor Market Shocks and the Demand for Trade Protection," and it's evidence from online surveys. And it's going to be a very, very narrow survey that we did, and I'll explain why we think this very narrow exercise is interesting more broadly. That's more or less what I will try to do. I hope I'm not going too fast. Is it okay? All right. All right. So it's good to start on what conventional economics says, all right? So conventional economics has this view that trade can have very sharp distributional effects in labor markets. And there is evidence of this, these shocks, particularly what's called the China shock, having a very big disruptive effect in labor markets, okay? But, and this is an important element, other labor market shocks tend to quantitatively dominate, okay? So, the skill bias technological change, automation, demand shifts account for a much larger share of the destruction of jobs in the US. So there's a famous paper by David Autor, who's been doing this great set of papers on the China shock. And the best estimates we have is that of the job destructions that took place during the 2000s, approximately 10% is due to the China shock. If you are going to allow for very indirect effects and you're very generous with your estimates, you get to 20%. But it's relatively small to compared to other shocks. So, of course, let me just put my timer so I know more or less where I'm at on the talk. We want to give time to questions. Of course, there is no reason to treat a labor market displacement due to trade differently from other sources of labor market churn. So economists have this view that when you get these shocks, the way to treat it is with unemployment insurance or transfers. And it's the same thing that when you have displacement due to other shocks. So in general, there is this sense that protectionism, that is part of the populist response, is a very distortionary deviation. And economists have this, for a long time explained protectionism as the result of interest groups that really push and pay Congress to pass protectionist laws, okay? But of course, the evidence is increasingly on the side of the preferences of people being against free trade, and that's what is interesting for us as economists. Why is it that we're so wrong? So basically, in economics, we assume that people care about basically material outcomes, so material and outcomes, not the process, in ways that are more or less stable. And we know from psychology that priming and preferences over other dimensions, not just the final outcome, can be important, okay? So that's kind of like a first contrast. And the question specifically for trade is if there are particular primes, particular ways of thinking about what's happening to us that are important in shaping preferences, okay? So that's more or less the idea. And economists don't live well with this idea that primes are important or that narratives are important. We think that there are these preferences that are stable, that are in the back, and if you tell it to me as a story that, in this way or another, as long as the substance stays the same, the priming shouldn't really affect it. Specifically, could it be that people care about the process that generates displacement? And could it be that this conditions the preferred policy response? That's kind of like the topic of the project. So this is connected to a thought experiment that Danny has been running in his classroom for a long time, which is as follows. So he asks his students, suppose we can engineer a social reordering that leaves Harry $5 richer and John $4 poorer. Should we do it? That's kind of like the question. The scenarios below describe different mechanisms that achieve those ends. So it's the same thing in the end, but it's going to, we're going to arrive to it through different paths. And the question is, should they be blocked or allowed to run the course? So this is a standard one. Harry works very hard, saves and invests a lot, and comes up with new techniques and products, while John lags behind, okay? And that's what generates the difference. A different scenario, Harry finds a cheaper or higher quality supplier in Germany. A different scenario is Harry outsources to a supplier in Bangladesh, which employs child workers in 12 hours a day, shifts, and under hazardous conditions. And even there, sometimes he includes this other scenario, which is even more extreme. Harry brings Bangladeshi workers to the US under temporary contracts and puts them to work under conditions that violate domestic labor, environmental, and safety laws. All right? So economists kind of don't see a difference, they don't see a reason to interfere, but students starkly rank these scenarios, okay? So of course they have less problems with the first one, and this is in decreasing order, but economists tend to see them equivalent. And in fact, they even see D, there's a reason, there's an argument for making D equivalent to B and C. But for sure, B and C are equivalent in the mind of economists, and that's not what people react. So there's something strange in the way we think, or different in the way we think, we as economists think from the general public. So the specific question for the project are these. We want to know whether people respond differently to job displacement that is due to technological change versus demand shifts versus bad management versus trade shocks. And within trade shocks, we have three different types of shocks. One is shock with a rich country, second is rich with a poor country, and third is trade with a poor country, emphasizing the fact that a poor country has poor labor standards. All right? And the question for sure is whether, if you are in the scenario where you see a technological shock, do you want something different that when you are under, you think it's a demand shock? Or do you want something different when you think it's a trade shock? That's kind of like the general question being asked. And how much do you want to trade off protectionism versus the preferred approach that economists have, which is to give transfers or retraining? Broadly speaking, how malleable are preferences for different kinds of government response? And of course, we are going against what economists think, which is this is a very stable thing. We don't, it's unlikely to be changed by these different frames. Okay? So what do? We produce a survey, which we call a minimal survey. All right? What is a minimal survey? Well, it's a very short survey that we administer on this platform called mTurk. We did it in June 2018, and we built it as a 10-minute anonymous survey about your opinions. That's kind of how we've done it. And we pay $1 for this amount of time. It's like 7 minutes on average, and it's very well compensated for this type of tasks. So lots of people, actually while they're in their jobs, take these surveys for money. And they make a fair bit of money by the end of the month. All right? We did lots of little tricks to ensure high quality. Okay? So we're going to look at almost 6,000, 7,000 people across the US who are sitting in their offices in different states of the US, and they are doing this very short survey for $1. And then we do small things like, for example, this is an approval rate. In previous tasks, you do a task or a survey, then I approve it, and then you get paid $1. If in your previous tasks the employer approved you on 80% of them, we let you take our survey. If not, we don't allow you. So these are good workers, So this is like a market for tasks, for short tasks, translations or little surveys which exist in the US. We tell them it's going to be very short, and that we just another technicality that we think it's important that these things are short because people's span of attention is not going to allow them to take on a very complicated survey. And since we're thinking about primes, we want them to focus on something for a short period of time. We don't want other primes to get in the way. People don't think the survey was biased. We have an attention check, which is another technicality to do this, etc., etc. All right? We also drop all the observations of people who take the survey fast. So they have to take more than a certain number of minutes, and we keep the 90% that take longer to survey. So sometimes they do it very, very fast, which is not likely that they're thinking about the answers, etc. Bottom line, we get 685 answers, which we think are usable, and they have a pretty good structure. I'll show you what this means. All right? All right, so that's more or less our approach. We're going to do this minimal survey. So let me tell you what the survey actually does. So it asks 3 questions, very short questions, like, do you think the poor are poor because they are lazy or because they are unlucky? Standard questions, 2 or 3 of those questions. And then immediately they are asked the key question of the survey. So it's really a very simple survey. So they are randomized into 6 treatments. One is a control group, and then there's this other alternative treatments. Okay, this is the treatment number 1. Now we're going to have a problem reading this. So give me 2 seconds, please. This is the technology shock. Okay, so they're going to be very similar. Look at, so I'll show you visually this. This is going to be the demand shock. This is the bad management shock. They're all almost, they look the same. I make you read a piece of news that we constructed. It looks like a piece of news from the newspaper. In fact, it has the same format as the New York Times. Mm-hmm. And it varies by a very small set of words. So I'll try to read you this one in full. So it says, 900 jobs are at risk at the YGF garment plant in Creekstown, which is facing closure. Our YGF spokesman said, as we continue our quest to serve our consumers better, we have been making investments in automation and other new technologies. This has required that we phase out our Creekstown operation and consolidate manufacturing in our other plants in the country. Many industries have been affected in recent years by technological progress, which lowers costs and raises productivity. And then an employee says, an employee of the plant who has been employed there for 18 years said the closure of the plant would have devastating consequences for the workers. Many will become unemployed, and the rest would have to accept lower paying jobs, he added. All right? So from there, we go to a question, which I'll show you in a minute, which asks, do you want protectionism or do you want transfers? This is going to happen in 2 minutes. But I want to tell you all the treatments. So this is called the technology treatment. Look at the demand shocks. The same thing. Local garment plant facing changes, the same title. No? 900 jobs are at risk at the YJ garment plant in Creekstown. It's exactly the same words. Everything is the same. We have had to adjust to lower consumer demand for the type of products we make here. That's the only difference here. And then it continues. This has required that we phase out our Creekstown. So it's minimal, the change from one treatment to the next. Let me show you the other treatment. What is this? Bad management, thank you. So the bad management one is the same thing, but there were management mistakes. That means we have to phase out the plant. And there's a worker which says an employee of the plant who has been employed there for 18 years said the closure of the plant would have devastated, exactly the same thing. Again, so first one, technology, because of automation. So second one, there were demand changes, so we have to change to adjust to the new demand. Third one, there were management mistakes. We phase out the plant. And then we get the trade shocks. There are 3 of these trade shocks. This one is, here we go. As we continue our quest to serve our consumers better, we have to ensure we remain competitive with other global firms. This has required that we face our critical operation and outsource the production to France. This is the first of the trade shock, the trade treatments. This is the developing country treatment, which is the same as that I read a minute ago, but it changes the word France for Cambodia. So it's identical except for one word now. Finally, it's the same thing, Cambodia, but we added this little description here. This is a bit more ambitious as a change, and it says in these poor countries sometimes they violate labor standards, etc. It reinforces this, but it's again one sentence. I'm close to done, very, very close to done. What is this? This is the control. We have a control group where nothing happens. There is this, like, the same story, and instead of the title facing closure, it's a plant facing changes. And the changes is some changes, but it says that they're going to be able to do it without really like changing, adjusting employment, etc. All right, so these are all these different groups who have these different treatments, and then there is the question. This is the outcome that we're interested in. What, if anything, do you think should be the response of the government? Option number 1, government should do nothing. Second, government should provide some financial assistance to workers who lose their jobs, for example, unemployment compensation or training assistance. 3, government should restrict imports of garments from overseas by placing import tariffs on such imports, for example. Okay? Those are the 3 options that people are given. The economists favor the option number 2. So that's kind of, okay, so let me summarize, very short survey with these very minimal differences, all right? And there is like one presumption, which is that most people, like economists, think that across the board, they should be expressing a preference for transfers. Rather than interfere with trade, voluntary exchange, what you want to do is just like deal with the ones that are affected by giving these transfers. And you could, tax the beneficiaries of trade. All right. These are the results. So this is it. This is just, the paper is here. You can see, the first thing to note is that the economist model, so let me just tell you what this is. Do nothing, black is do nothing. The gray is transfers. The blue is protectionism. And you can see in the control, let's stay with the control group for a second, that the answer that most people choose, 70% of people choose, is transfer. So the economic model kind of does okay, huh? Most people choose transfers. There's a group like 19% who chooses nothing, do nothing. So these are more extreme, laissez-faire, more extreme like on the right, more conservative. And then there's 9% who, in the baseline, they want protectionism. So it's kind of very good news for the economic model, I think. So what happens when you move to the treatments? First, the do-nothing category on average goes down quite a bit. And protectionism increases quite a bit relative to this part here. So that's like but detecting the marginal effects here, it's complicated, etc. So I've calculated, done a statistical analysis in a way that you control for all the differences of people here and there, etc. And you just report the marginal effects. So here's an even cleaner way of looking at it, just to summarize the effects. So what is this? These are the responses to labor market displacement shocks. And these I am reporting are the marginal effects on the shares of respondents that respond favorably to the statement at the bottom of the chart relative to the control. So here is technological change, the treatment technological change, and this is the people. So what happens here is that the do-nothing category went down, and where did it go? More or less equally to transfers and to protectionism in the technological story, okay? That's how to read this thing. So, first finding is that for the demand shift and the technological change, there's broadly similar results that you get this increase in protectionism and an increase in transfers and a drop in the desire to do nothing. This is more interesting. This is the fact that the trade shocks lead to the strongest demand for protectionism. That's kind of reasonable, I would say. And interestingly enough, this is completely contrary to the way that economists would predict. You just changed one word, France for Cambodia, and you get this much bigger increase in the desire for protectionism. Okay? These are percentage points, so this is quite a chunk. Well, this is a spectacular failure of the way that economists think about this, which is that there's a drop in the desired transfers relative to the control. So, in fact, so you have to do nothing, but it's all going to this increase in protectionism. All right, let me just check where I'm at. Okay, so I have to speed up a little bit if I want to have some time for questions. This is the bad management shock, which is the only scenario where you don't have an effect on protectionism. It's the only scenario where people actually don't want to give more protectionism to these workers, and this is the only scenario where you get a significant increase in transfers. In all the other scenarios, the drop in or the change in transfers is insignificant. So here is like an interesting treatment that we have to think more about how to interpret. My preferred interpretation is the following, which is that people actually understand some of the trade-offs when you give protection. In fact, you're going to be giving protection to managers and to owners which were incompetent and drove the problem. So in that case, they don't want to give protection and they want to give transfers to workers. So it tells us that the people are not answering these questions like, randomly. They kind of are putting a fair bit of structure, I think, to this. And we have more work on this. If you're interested, I can talk about it afterwards. Now, I want to put this in terms of persuasion rates. The persuasion rate is this way of taking into account for baseline preferences. So what I've shown you, is it big or is it small? Okay, so in propaganda, when I am targeting you, these guys, I'm trying to convince you that, the best thing in the world is I don't know, that Messi is better than Ronaldo. So if I target you with this activity, I have to first figure out how many people are not convinced of that obvious fact, by the way, in here. Oh, it's this particular group. So then I have to adjust the baseline level, etc. So the people that are targeted, you have to divide by that, etc. And that gives you the persuasion rate. And the reason why it's interesting to do the persuasion rate is because De La Viña and Genskow have done this review where there are all these papers estimating persuasion rates of different propaganda campaigns, all right? And when you look at that, at the range of estimates, the estimates we get here are extremely large, are at the upper range of this. So it looks like this very tiny little minimal treatment, the way that, and in one, if you want, the more extreme one is focus on the word Cambodia versus the word France. They carry an enormous amount. You're getting a change in the persuasion rate like you've not seen in any of these other papers in the De La Viña Genskow project. And you got that just by changing Cambodia versus France. So this is something that it's like really operational in the minds of these people. And you get these very large effects. What else should I say? Well, they look very large, even though the elasticities on transfers are smaller. And the reason, of course, is that the transfer baselines were very high. So there were very few people that remained to be convinced. That's why, even though the coefficient is small, the persuasion rates are high, almost as high as protectionism, okay? So even though the point estimate for protectionism was 6 times bigger. All right, I want to say a couple of things about the setup. I want to talk very briefly about the Trump supporters versus the Clinton supporters. I'm going to show you something very surprising about the differences there, and I think I can conclude then, all right, and open up for questions. So I've done that. What is this? This is how representative the data is. It's a group of workers, these MTurk workers, are a little bit more educated and a little younger than the American population. So it's how much you can extrapolate this to the whole American. It's not directly, but it's not very far off, okay? So they're a bit more educated and a bit younger. These are the baseline effects of the covariates. This is like a summary of all of the shocks together, which I think is useful to present for many reasons, but given the problem of time, let me just emphasize one thing. When you put all the correlations between the characteristics of the respondents and their desire for protectionism, it's extremely similar to other surveys that have been done. So in particular, women, is that women? I can't see very well. I think it's women. That's female, yes. So the women are a bit more protectionist than men. Education, the uneducated makes you a bit more protectionist. And here it's it's exactly what you would expect with the correlation with whether you are leaning towards Clinton or towards Trump. So it squares pretty well the structure of the data. Let me, I can show you so it's, I have like 5 minutes, so I have to make choices now. I won't show you this. This is all very interesting, but I won't get into the details. I want to spend my time on political ideology, okay, political preferences. So what is this? This is so we are now trying to figure out the structure of this. We are going to be looking at people with different political inclinations. So if you look here, this is a Clinton supporter. This is a Trump supporter. This is center by leaning Trump, and this is center by leaning Clinton. Okay? So it squares it's pretty logical and consistent with what people know. Remember, this is not artificial consistency on this psychological paper. If I ask you, are you a Clinton supporter? Yes. And do you, no, this is like, a different thing. We are getting the effect from these treatments. So it's not that people are just trying to be consistent in their head. All right. What does this tell us? It tells us that this is the black thing is the control. This is the non-trade shocks, the demand, the technology, and the bad management. These are here. And these are the trade shocks. The 3 trade shocks clumped together. So what do we get? So first, you do get this fact that Trump supporters are very susceptible to trade. So the more you are a trade supporter, a Trump supporter, the bigger the increases here. So you were treated and they react very starkly there. So this is another part which is like pretty striking. So, like these guys are, so Clinton supporters, when they are shocked, they are as protectionist as a standard Trump supporter. So this is pretty shocking, I think, because I've done nothing. So we think of the Clinton supporters as being very different from the Trump supporters. But they are giving us the same policy preferences with a minimal treatment. So bottom line, these guys are the Clinton supporters and these guys are the Trump supporters. They hate each other. They they shout, they say unpleasant things, they think they're the world apart. You should come to Harvard and you should see what, my liberal colleagues think of the Trump supporters. Yet, when I just treat them minimally, they give me the same answer. So that's a pretty striking finding. This is by how they differ by the educational attainment. Here you get the people who are more educated to be less protectionist. But you can see that with the trade shocks, there are these very big jumps. So it seems that everybody with these minimal treatments end up being much more attracted to protectionism. I have to finish, but I want to tell you about one more result and I'm done. And we can open it up for talking, for questions and about this and broader issues if you want. Okay, so the one more thing I want to do, let me think first. Okay, so the way to present it is by looking at this. So what is it that we are doing here? So these are all the trade shocks, and these are like, the columns are the different activities, okay? This is a marginal change, and this is the prediction. Now, these are the different groups. These are the Clinton guys, center Clinton, center Trump, okay? Now, what you're getting is that these guys are, the Trump guys, have higher numbers because they want more protectionism, okay? So this is bigger numbers than here. The interesting thing, this is a very cute little thing, this is a developing nation, okay? And these guys want, much more than these guys. But when I emphasize the labor standards thing, so the difference between this line, and this line, this is Cambodia, and this is Cambodia, but reminding you that in Cambodia there are these like labor standards, etc. So the Clinton guys want more protectionism because I have reminded you that there are these labor standard problems there. But the Trump guys kind of go the opposite way. And I don't want to make a big deal out of this because when you look at the difference, it's significant, statistically speaking, at, it's borderline, it's like at 9% level. So it's not like very strong, but it is interesting that these Trump supporters don't like it, they're a bit contrarian. When you start reminding them of what the way they should be thinking, they start going in the opposite direction. And I am particularly interested in this because I think a lot of the problem in populism, and I leave this as my last comment to open up for questions later on, is that part of the reaction against populism is that there's a group of people that are fed up with liberals, I think. And with this idea that there's only one way of thinking, and that when we particularly economists, I think we are particularly egregious here, when we talk to some of these, we explain trade or etc., we kind of talk down to people. We explain to them what they should be thinking. And I think that generates this, is part of this backlash. So let me just summarize what I've done. So we're thinking about the political economy of trade policy. Here we've been looking at preferences rather than interest group pressure and buying votes, etc. This is more on the demand side of protectionism. And here we have isolated different shocks, different types of shocks to labor markets. And we have tried to understand the demand for protection, giving them always the option of transfers, which is the preferred policy by economists, all right? And then we have this finding that ideas versus material interests seem to matter a lot. There is a role for persuasion, worldviews, and there is this very big malleability of interests, which I tell you some story about what's going on, even if it's the same thing, it's the same outcome, the same plant closure, etc. But if it's something that you perceive as unfair or something, it's a very different story than if you think it's fair. And this is consistent, of course, with what populists and the anti-globalization crowd have been pushing.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. You know, the revolt against the so-called gauche caviar is common to many countries, including Italy. And this it explains in part, a good part, the victory of Trump and of Salvini, just to mention with there. And thanks also for having demonstrated that a sort of soul, protectionist spirit lies below the surface in any one of us. And because, and finally, it's interesting to remark that you insisted that changing the word Cambodia, but I assume it would be the same if I change to Laos, Vietnam, even China, immediately reacts. There is a reaction. It triggers a reaction because Cambodia is seen as a danger because for sure it can manage lower pace, bad condition, and despite this, which is disturbing, there is a danger for the better price policy. Ok, domande, prego. La signora lì. Vedi. Grazie. Ah sì, sure. Very interesting.
Well, thank you for your presentation, very interesting. I was wondering about one aspect. The scenario you proposed to the respondents was a scenario with production, which is quite easy to understand. I mean, choice between different scenario of a firm that goes with problems. What about if it would have been financial protection? Which is a very hot topic, I mean, also in populism or orientation in terms of economic reaction.
If the option was financial,
yeah, what about if I ask instead of propose an article, instead of an article about a firm that goes bad because of bad management, demand problems, about buying stocks, derivatives, and other types of financial, products that also are related to globalization and to economic shocks, especially in the Western countries.
So it's a great question. We haven't thought too much about it. We're just starting, and as you can imagine, in economics, this is seen as not like the most obvious. They don't understand what. One unkind way of putting it is that we are justifying populism, which is not what we're doing. We're just trying to understand it. But to your point, I think you're exactly right. It is a super interesting question to dimension to study. We haven't thought about it, but off the top of my head, I can see two different things that we would have to study. Look, it's a great question. One of them, for sure, is the interest rate. So, in some countries, the way the economy operates with extraordinarily high interest rates. Brazil is one classic example, and then, in countries with very high levels of debt, when you get this bad periods of confidence, not that long ago, it happened to the southern Europe. you get these big spikes in interest rates. And I wonder, you're exactly right, I wonder how people react to displacement caused by something that is obviously not the fault of the workers or of the firms. So I would have to think about how to structure that. Let me say one extra thing, which I think you're also right, which is on capital flows. Capital flows, we have, in economics, there's been this like movement towards more globalization, trade, etc., and towards capital flows. And capital flows, the benefits that exist from capital flows, the evidence on it is much smaller than on trade. On trade, it's already pretty small, by the way, but economists have exaggerated how good trade is and how much evidence we have, etc. But with capital flows, there is a big backlash, I think, when the country, you get a run on the currency, etc. So we would have to think about how to frame it, and it would have to be different setting. This is the beauty of this project, is that the M-Turk thing is fantastic to do it, but you cannot use it in developing countries because you can't really pay people with M-Turk. So we will have to think out how, in America they won't understand anything about capital flows or etc. They won't relate to. In any developing country, you tell them there's a run and every single person understands what it means. So we would have to do it in developing countries. But it's a great idea. The financial dimension, we haven't thought about it at all. So I don't have a lot of interesting to answer there.
That's also probably, Professor. That's why when the currency devalues goes down, if it's a positive thing most of times for advanced countries because they can export more easily, is a tragedy for developing countries because they have highly indebted in dollars, for instance, and they have immediately a capital run from their country.
There's a person in the back.
Yeah, I do something like this informally with my students, where I have them compare technology-based change and trade-based change. And a common response is the technology change is okay, but they object to the trade because the other country gains. For some reason, the fact that the other country gains is a negative. Do you find that kind of effect?
I think you're right. There is something strange in what people think is going on with trade. So we never got in the debriefing or what we've studied, it's not that the other countries gained. Well, you're right, yes, it is in fact. They have this strange theory that they're selling to you goods very cheaply now, and then they will raise prices or something. They are doing dumping. And when you present to them the evidence that the prices have been declining for, like, in trade with Japan or trade with whatever, that the prices keep going down, they have something about what you're saying, which is that they have something up their sleeve, or they're gaining something more than what is there. So in a generous interpretation, it has something to do with some other externalities or something, but I think it's more of like something we don't understand either, fairness. So for example, look at France versus Cambodia. Why? Why do you have like a lower, it's the same, exactly same thing. Suddenly, if it's France, I kind of think, well, we have it deserved. We are kind of like the French. How come we can't compete with the French? We still get an enormous increase in protectionism desired, by the way. But why is it not as high as with Cambodia? Well, because there's something like fair or something. So, but you're right that we haven't understood what is it that people think about the other country. We don't have like a lot to say, but probably there's the key. Yeah. Yes.
This thing you were just saying, something that shocks me more or less, could it be connected to the control? I can face a technological change. I cannot face a worker that do the same thing as I do for 1/3 of the price. So I can control because I can improve myself, but I cannot control and accept to be paid less than a Cambodian.
It's a good idea. It's a good idea. That might be a way of thinking about it, that there is if it's something that is under my control, well, you're right that the technological part, Well, the bad management one is the one that is more clearly under the control and we screwed up. And that's where people are less willing to increase protectionism. So I think I think that should be, that we could study that more. But again, it's interesting that we have like a fantasy about how much control we have things, and like, you know, I don't know what to make of like the fact that sometimes, like, you know, how come the Germans keep improving productivity year after year after year? It's like extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it. And why is that like, like, you know, we would have to do it with Germany. We haven't tried that. But perhaps at some point people like to think that I have a theory of justice, and but at some point it's like also tainted by self-interest. And at some point with the Germans, you just give up. Like you say, no, I'm not going to compete with these guys. This is ridiculous. So that would be like a good setting to test, to go further with what you're saying. To think about it with Germany, because it is actually part of the data that they have this year in, year out, increasing productivity over and above the increasing productivity of any other country in Europe. So it's pretty extraordinary. So that would be like the setting to study that further.
May I ask you a question, Professor?
Please.
Going to the current fact, the threatened or even implemented tariffs by Trump against China, maybe against Europe, the breaking news of this morning, even against Mexico, because of his reasons.
Everybody's getting it.
Everybody is getting his part. What can be the consequences for Italy, for instance, for a country like Italy, direct consequences inside the economy of a country? First of all, I presume the trade in the world decreases, but what are the consequences, the practical consequences for a country like Italy?
Look, Italy is in a particularly bad position, I think, because they are. Well, of course, it's fun to make fun of the Italians. It's a terrible economy, a lot of debt, etc. But you guys forget that you are one of the world's largest exporters for a long time, and of like pretty good goods, very high-end goods, lots of. So Italy has been a spectacular success in terms of when you think, like, only you isolate the fact that you're able to export in very high-end places for a very long period of time in spite of very high costs and lots of regulations. So anything that is going to bring us away from a world where we are trading a lot is going to hurt Italy on the biggest strength that Italy has. I don't, nobody has the future, the ball for the future, but it is very puzzling where this is going to lead us. And I think it's the one with Mexico is particularly, sorry, but it's much more worrying than for Italy, because of course the Mexicans opened up and they have all this investment strategy that is complementing to trade with one country. So it's pretty extraordinary that this is going to happen. It's a big default on their international responsibilities. It's not the first time. The Americans sometimes forget about this part, but the U.S. has a tradition of breaking up the promises to the international community. The Bretton Woods is the most the unilateral removal of the U.S. from the Bretton Woods arrangement in the 70s is the most striking one. But this is another one. We all organized our economies in a world regime which had some rules, and the first ones to violate it is the U.S. So it is very disappointing, because of course within Italy, within Argentina, within Mexico, there are people who think that the U.S. is the evil, etc. And this gives them a lot of material, even though I think it's like, happening for accidental reasons in terms of Trump. I think it's a pretty big, I wouldn't say a tragedy, but it is a big step back from where we were going. So I guess it's particularly for big exporters. Argentina is a very unsuccessful exporter. So we are a very closed economy. We export nothing of very high value, etc. So it's a completely different ballgame than for you guys. So
No, because Italy is directly affected not only for the export, but also for the parts of because in the value the world in the parts it makes for other productions.
Yes, of course.
Because the value chain on the
value chain,
world,
yeah.
yes, is all the consequences. Okay, any other question? What time is it now? So maybe that we can close our conversation right now. Siamo stati bravi, vero? Abbiamo finito esattamente come ci hanno detto, 5:30. Adesso alle 6 c'è un altro dibattito. Grazie, arrivederci a tutti.
Thank you.